very nice to be back here at CMES. So thank you to CMES and MENAS for hosting this talk today, and thank you all for coming out at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the semester. So it's wonderful. It's bad form to start with an apology, but I'm going to start with two. One, I threw out my back yesterday at the gym. Not what it sounds like. I actually threw it out picking up my infant son and putting him into the childcare area before I even started working out. But it's given my movements a kind of Frankensteinish quality, and I can't necessarily see everyone at once, but I'll try. And also the apologies from Lynn Staeheli, who is in Beirut at the moment and couldn't be here today. She is with our colleagues, so I'd also like to acknowledge Dima Smera and Konstantin Kastristianakis, who both worked on the production of the digital story map, which I'll be presenting a bit on today. So this is, as Anne mentioned, a collaborative work, and it's a co-authored paper, but despite that, I just want to make clear that any errors or oversights are completely my colleagues'. Anything factual or interesting is definitely all me. But yes, as Anne mentioned, this is part of a wider study led by Lynn Staeheli, who is the head of geography here. And we call it U-Citizen for short because that's an awfully long title. But U-Citizen is a multi-sided, multi-level research ethnography looking at attempts to promote youth citizenship and participation as a mode of conflict transformation in divided societies. And when I say multi-level, I mean on one hand we're interested in the ways in which these techniques or policies or knowledges around youth participation circulate globally through what we call a citizenship industry and how they kind of materialize in various post-conflict settings. And so that's one kind of global layer. And then nationally we're looking at 3 case study countries, Lebanon, which I'll be talking about today, but also Bosnia and Herzegovina and South Africa. And these case study countries were chosen because they're all countries that there's a youth population of around 18 to 25-year-old young people who have come of age entirely in an era of post-conflict or post-apartheid in the case of South Africa. And our interest really is in what's happened in those intervening years and to what effect have been these international civil society efforts to promote citizenship and what are youth and young people's understandings of those efforts. And that's kind of where the other spectrum of this multi-leveled ethnography comes in, which is the spaces of daily life. Because our interest is in how young people, again, make sense of these efforts to promote participation and how they define citizenship and belonging in divided societies and cities that have undergone conflict. And it's towards that end of the spectrum that I'll be speaking about today, specifically in Beirut, Lebanon. So in societies emerging from division and conflict like Lebanon, history and memory are as contested as space and territory. Indeed, it's difficult to disentangle them. For example, in Lebanon, the history that young people learn in schools presents a more palatable version of the past, embracing national unity over division and downplaying any mention of the Civil War. And yet young people's physical surroundings in cities like Beirut bear the traces of violence and histories of past conflict not so easily concealed. Likewise, although citizenship education projects run by civil society organizations may seek to promote dialogue and tolerance and unity and understanding towards the goal of building a brighter future, traumatic memories of past violence and victimization continue to be embedded in young people's families, their homes, and their neighborhoods. So how do young people themselves make sense of these everyday, entangled temporalities of life in a city scarred by violence? And crucially, how might they be imagining and creating new spaces and forms of belonging that strive towards alternative futures? So in seeking answers to these questions today, I want to present some early findings that have emerged from a creative, place-based digital storytelling project that we've conducted with young people in Beirut. In presenting these initial findings, we also hope to offer a preliminary evaluation of digital storytelling as a visual research methodology that both elicits responses to the questions of how young people make sense of and form place-based attachments to the city, but also serves as a technique for provoking and creating different imaginations or creative reimaginings of the city. And for also exploring how young people relate to the past as well as their desires for the future. Specifically, we argue that digital storytelling can be a useful methodology for triangulating between history, memory, and the material traces of the past embedded in everyday surroundings, and also for exploring how young people understand, experience, and reimagine belonging in the city. So for the rest of my time here today, I want to briefly situate the project within a wider set of debates about memory, amnesia, and public space in Beirut, as well as broader intellectual debates about memory and nostalgia as part of modern urban living. From here, I move to a discussion about digital storytelling as a mode of public memory and as a repository for vernacular memory. And here I hope to explore the role of digital storytelling in producing a collective or kind of collective sense of public memory. Following this discussion, we turn to our empirical case, including a brief explanation of our methodological approach and the nuts and bolts of putting together this digital storytelling map that I'll be showing you later. I'll be showing some examples of the stories that we produce with the young people, and here we hope to tease out some of the different approaches to narrating the past, critiquing the present, and gesturing at the future that these stories adopt. Specifically, we'll present an initial analysis of these stories drawing upon Svetlana Boym's notion of restorative and reflective nostalgia, which I'll get into in a moment. But first, I just want to provide a bit of historical and geographic orientation. How are we doing here? Okay. So having long had a reputation of cosmopolitanism and cultural openness, Beirut in the 1950s and 60s experienced a period of particularly lively, if somewhat unstable, political and cultural exchange. And this is the famous Martyrs Square in Beirut in the 1950s. This was also a period of rapid urbanization and rural to urban migration, as is depicted in this picture here, which was found on a popular kind of old Beirut photo blog. And the presence of these blogs itself kind of suggests this prevalence of urban nostalgia in the city. As literary scholar Ghenwa Hayek observes, perhaps in response to this urbanization, Lebanon's popular culture as well as its education system was dominated by rural nostalgia and a celebration of village life in Mount Lebanon. This enshrining of the rural idol in national identity was occurring at a time when Beirut was itself replacing Mount Lebanon as a symbol of the nation. However, the cultural and political dynamism of the 1950s and 60s, as you all know, gave way to a period of prolonged political violence and urban warfare during the Lebanese Civil War between 1975 and 1990. During this time, the city was divided. This is a rough kind of depiction of that division between West Beirut, predominantly Muslim, including Palestinian factions, although these were largely secular groups, pan-Arabists, some of them, and East Beirut dominated mostly by Christian militias. But even during this time, the city still continued to experience growth, particularly in the southern urban, suburban areas, as the kind of the rural to urban migration continued as a result of the 1978 to 2000 invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon. So a lot of continued migration to Beirut in the southern suburbs. Since the end of the Civil War, Beirut has witnessed a dramatic urban redevelopment. Oh, and just to, yes. So the green line dividing East and West Beirut, no guesses for why it was called the Green Line. This kind of no man's land that existed between the two divides in the city was kind of rewilded and became this kind of urban forest, which is why it took the name the Green Line. But since the end of the Civil War, Beirut witnessed dramatic urban redevelopment, including the rapid transformation of parts of the city that had been severely damaged during the fighting. This was fueled by Lebanese expatriate investment, as well as Gulf-financed real estate development. And some of the most affected areas of the war underwent complete transformations. Indeed, even before the hostilities ended, political and business elites were already eyeing areas of urban destruction as opportunities for massive construction and development. So the former Green Line that we see here was the primary target of urban renewal by Solidaire. And Solidaire is a controversial semi-public, semi-private real estate development venture that transformed the central business district and the Green Line into high-end residential and commercial properties, as we see here. And property values in this area are sky high, meaning that even buildings that didn't really experience or weren't damaged heavily during the war, such as kind of Ottoman era mansions and early 20th century villas, they're being left to crumble and decay so that they could be knocked down in order to put up Dubai style tower blocks and glitzy office towers. So it makes for this kind of visual urban landscape of contrast with modernist icons like the 1960s Egg Building and the Holiday Inn of the 1970s stand as next to these kind of new buildings as reminders of these previous eras of ambition. And the redevelopment of Beirut's central business district has been primarily and particularly controversial. Not the sole property of any sect or political faction, downtown Beirut, especially Martyrs Square, which we saw earlier, is remembered at least as a symbol of Beirut's public life and culture, and as such was seen as central to the creation of a non-sectarian urban identity in the wake of a traumatic and divisive war. However, the redevelopment of downtown Beirut was not undertaken with the aim of creating a space for the people, where a new sense of national unity could be forged, but instead it was constructed as a space for wealthy tourists, a quote, enclave for the super wealthy of the region, as Sari Makdisi put it in his off-quoted 1997 article, Laying Claim to Beirut. In a way, the post-war homogenization of space in the downtown area is akin to the post-war self-imposed amnesia in the country as a whole. Now, Thomas Hobbes argued, following the English Civil War, that a sense of forgetting was the basis of a just state, and that amnesia was the basis of the social contract. But observers of Lebanon like Sun Hagbul argued that the infamous and state-sanctioned amnesia that occurred following the Lebanese Civil War was more the result of the fact that yesterday's combatants became today's politicians who had little interest in shedding light on their past deeds. So this was not as part of any kind of concerted strategy for dealing with the lingering wounds of war. And this is, again, downtown Beirut today. You can barely see Martyrs Square in the background, and then most of the kind of mixed-use high-end developments of Solid Air kind of ringing Martyrs Square. There's the Egg Building, Muhammad Al-Amin Mosque there. Just going back to Makdisi's article, in the absence of an accepted national narrative, a war of smaller narratives emerged as part of what Makdisi calls the decentralization of memory. Again, writing in 1997, Makdisi described the post-war battle over space in Lebanon as a narrative struggle. Blank or not, the city center is a surface that will be inscribed in the coming years in ways that will help to determine the unfolding narrative of Lebanon's national identity, which is even more open to question. The battles this time will take the form of narratives, written in space and time and on the presently cleared out blankness of the center of Beirut. We know, however, that Beirut is not, nor was it, a blank slate, regardless of how property developers might see it. Rather, the urban space of Beirut has been inscribed and reinscribed with histories of violence, destruction, and reconstruction. Elsewhere, we've described this process of layering of memory as a palimpsest, which is defined as a piece of parchment on which the original writing has been erased in order to make room for subsequent inscriptions, and yet of which the previous eras of writing continue to remain. As Hussein reminds us, in the physical environment, these traces may trigger an urban imaginary that includes memories of what was there before, as well as imagined alternatives to what there is. So it is to this potentially transformative effect of memory that I want to turn now. How are we doing? It's hard for me to see the screen here, so I have to keep looking back. In her book, The Future of Nostalgia, Svetlana Boym argues that nostalgia is not always about the past, that it can be retrospective as well as prospective. Coined by a Swiss doctor in 1688, the word nostalgia combines two Greek root words, nostos meaning a return home, and algia meaning pain, specifically the pain of longing for home. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, nostalgia was viewed as a psychological disorder that could be cured. It could be cured by leeches, hypnosis, opium, or a visit to the Alps for some fresh air. Sounds like a good weekend. But by the 20th century, this disease of nostalgia had become pandemic. A sense of longing was not so much a part of a counter-modernity, but a prevailing condition of modernity itself. In her survey of post-Soviet nostalgia, Boym distinguishes between two forms of nostalgia: restorative and reflective. Restorative nostalgia, she writes, stresses the nostos and attempts a transhistorical reconstruction of the lost home. This form of nostalgia drives much religious and nationalist revivals today. So think of slogans like, "Make America Great Again," perfect example, and obviously the spatial politics of that, which includes building 40-foot border walls. The reflective nostalgia, in contrast, thrives in the algia, or the longing itself, as Boym writes. It is associated with movement, and it, quote, delays the homecoming, wistfully, ironically, desperately. But could we also add hopefully? Not a vain hope for the return to the past or the restoration of home, but the optimistic desire that resides in the longing for a new kind of belonging, almost a prefigurative nostalgia for a home to come, coupled with a reticence to define concretely what that form of belonging should look like. We're a bit wary of approaching restorative and reflective nostalgia as a kind of strict dualism. And likewise, we don't want to just uncritically celebrate the kind of fragmentary nature of memory that is suggested by reflective nostalgia, particularly in an area where it's the fragmentation of memory that itself is seen as part of the problem. However, distinguishing between these two forms of nostalgia and these two forms of longing, restorative and reflective, does present a helpful hermeneutic, and forces us to think of nostalgia beyond just the negative connotations. As geographer Alistair Bonnet reminds us, within geography there's a general hostility to place-bound nostalgias, which are seen as exclusionary, reactionary, and in part a reaction to this anxiety caused by hypermodernity and globalization. Place-based identities in general are seen as too fixed, too bounded, and too rooted in the past, as Tim Cresswell writes, reflecting a broader postmodern unease with notions of place. Bonnet argues, though, that nostalgia can have both productive and disruptive effects, that even a simple restorative nostalgia can sometimes, quote, inspire what is critical and reflective. As Bonnet again argues, nostalgia and aspirations to belong have roots that are not necessarily pre-critical or fixed. But again, these desires to belong raise the question of to what do we belong, with whom, and where? And it's this question that motivates us, particularly the question of how young people form attachments to place and to publics that are within multiply inscribed places like post-war Beirut. How might young people be seeking to write a new narrative of belonging on top of and within the margins of this palimpsestic urban space that we've described? So to understand how young people perceive and seek to creatively intervene in urban space, we turn to the medium of digital storytelling. And I'll just turn briefly to an explanation of the term in this method. But here are some of the young people we worked with training for the production of these digital stories, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Now, digital storytelling refers generally to the practice of producing short 3 to 5 minute digital films or montages that combine digital photographs and archival images, as well as sounds, music, and voiceover narrative. Often, digital storytelling is conducted in small, intimate group settings as part of informal arts and education projects, and this technique has its roots in history in community theater and public radio. As Burgess et al. Observed, though, digital storytelling is increasingly emerging not only as a tool for mediatizing individual memories, but also in facilitating public histories. Digital storytelling differs from archival practices such as oral history in that it aims to produce rather than merely capture vernacular cultural expressions at a given moment in time. Such vernacular memories often challenge the triumphal narratives of history produced in official expressions of public memory, including heritage sites and museums. Like other forms of verbal performance and visual art, digital stories do not simply reflect social life, but have the capacity to critically reflect upon it. Uniquely, in coupling and recombining sight and sound, digital storytelling is situated at the productive interplay between seeing and hearing, between distant and intimate, external and internal, representational and effective, public and private, and indeed past and present. As such, digital storytelling, Rose argues, offers a space for representing to the other, the ambivalence and contradiction that can characterize the interminable process of relating our inner reality to the external world. In other words, it is a method for observing how we experience ourselves in the world. Digital stories, as Hull and Katz argue, can be learning spaces where individuals and groups can define and redefine themselves in relation to the world and the other. Hannah Arendt once said of stories that they are a way of translating personal experience into public meaning. If public formation entails the creation of new social forms, and if publics are pedagogical in the sense that they are sites of learning about the experiences of others, then digital storytelling is potentially a practice of poetic public formation, a creative doing or world-making in which new forms of sociability emerge, and in which existing tropes of identity and belonging are at once reproduced but also potentially transformed. And just to turn to kind of the training of the young people and how we carried out this project, we worked in Beirut, Lebanon with a youth organization that is non-sectarian or multi-sectarian, representing young people from different parts of the city and different backgrounds. And we trained a group of 6 youth researchers, as we call them, in Beirut, on storytelling techniques, interviewing, digital photography, archival work, as well as digital video editing, in order to produce their own digital stories. Some of these stories are autobiographical, although the majority of them are produced out of interviews with peers and elders. So once they kind of practiced and did their own autobiographical story, they then went out to interview members of their family, their peers, members of their community, and other communities, in order to find out these stories of place that are embedded in their own neighborhoods. All the stories are about place, and they're about everyday routines and how they're made meaningful through memories and stories. We have then embedded these digital stories into an online interactive map to emphasize how these stories emerge out of the urban environment, and also to make these stories kind of available to people who are from other parts of the city, and indeed from outside Beirut altogether. In producing our digital story map, we drew upon and combined aspects of geovisualization, and such as photo mapping, as well as critical approaches to and qualitative GIS, as well as creative visual and narrative methods like photo voice and storytelling. However, there are some typical pitfalls of using creative and visual methods that we sought to avoid. Visual methods are often employed with research with young people as a kind of ethnographic realism, that the camera can offer this kind of unadulterated view into the real lives of young people. Likewise, creative methods and creativity in general is often seen kind of unproblematically as being the natural language of young people, and that young people are the kind of sole authors of their own destinies. And we kind of wanted to avoid that language, and we sought to offer a different approach. By co-constructing their digital stories with their peers and with their elders, and by using images and sounds from their everyday environments, as well as archival photographs and other ephemera, we emphasize how these stories are never told in isolation. As De Soto says of stories about place, they are makeshift things composed of the world's debris. In this way, the digital story is not merely a retelling of event, but a montage that potentially opens up new relations and new ways of seeing the world. And in Beirut, and also I think even more so in Sarajevo, where we also conducted this project, this digital storytelling practice became a way of kind of facilitating this intergenerational dialogue about the war, which, there's still a lot of taboo and fear about asking your parents or your grandparents how they participated in that war or not. So in our initial reading of these stories and the map that they collectively produce, we have identified several different approaches to narrating the past, some of which veered more towards restorative forms of nostalgia, and others which embrace a more reflective approach. A number of stories, for example, focus on a particular neighborhood and present a straightforward timeline of temporal progression, typically a nostalgic past, interrupted by a violent conflict, but giving way to a future characterized by openness and diversity. So, for example, in one digital story, a young woman narrates the story of her mother, talking about the neighborhood of Ain al-Ramana. And it's a somewhat kind of nostalgic narrative of how the place used to be, that ends quite abruptly with the Ain al-Ramana bus incident, which sparked the Civil War. And then her voice comes in and says, but that's my mother's story. I want to talk about my story, which starts in 1991. And she describes the same neighborhood as now being kind of marked by openness and diversity. And she concludes by saying, with the old adage, may the past be recalled but never repeated. So there's this attempt to really kind of quickly narrate the war and then keep it at arm's length. Other stories present a less optimistic view of the future of diversity, instead focusing on the irredeemable loss and longing for the past, and we'll see a few examples of that. However, even these stories carried some meaning and hope for the young people who helped digitize them. So, for example, one story is about a man who longingly recalls all these misadventures that he and his friends used to get into in Tariqa Jadida, a particular area of Beirut. And the story in particular that he talks about is being arrested as part of this students' rights protests in the 1960s, and how he was humiliated, and he was sprayed with water, and he said he vowed never to again be part of any kind of political demonstrations. But the message that the young person who interviewed this gentleman and who made the story took from that was, there used to be a time when political protests were about issues and weren't just kind of party-based sectarian kind of performances, and he actually took great inspiration from that kind of moment in the past. So it was interesting how young people derived different kind of lessons and meanings from that. Indeed, many of the stories that present a more nostalgic view of the past, and which mourn this destruction of memory, even in those stories, there's a sense that within the partial erasures of the past and the marginal spaces of the present, we can still find these kind of glimmers of hope for the future on which to build new ways of belonging and relating to each other. And so I'll turn now to, this is another one of the young people who was involved in the project, capturing some sound for his digital story. But I'll go to the story map now. So just to kind of get our bearings here, without making you too dizzy, this is American University of Beirut. Here's downtown Beirut, which we were looking at earlier. But the majority of the young people who were part of this project came from southern Beirut, in particular the areas around Horsh Beirut, which is this massive urban park, or really arboretum in the center of Beirut, which has been closed to the public since the Civil War. And the kind of official reason why it's been closed is because there's a fear that it'll be taken over, that young people will do God knows what in this park if it's opened up, and that Beirutis aren't yet ready for the responsibility of having this public space. So the youth organization we worked with are involved in campaigns to get the park opened, as well as to protect other public spaces like beaches in Beirut. And they've actually had some success. The park is now partially open for a certain number of hours during the week, and they're trying to get it open fully. But the decision of the young people, since they were focusing on the park, they really wanted to do stories that were in their neighborhoods that surrounded the park and that included the park in their narratives, or the Horsh as it's called. So I'll show a few stories. One I will begin with. We've got time for a few. One is appropriately called The Old Style. Okay, so it's a nice story, and in many ways it's kind of drenched in this Haneen, this nostalgia, and in some ways, quite clearly, kind of a restorative sense of nostalgia. He's actually saying, I would like to go back to the 1950s and 60s, this kind of romantic pre-Civil War era. And you might criticize that in terms of even the gendered politics inherent in that, in terms of wanting to restore the family home, and the potentially kind of sectarian nature of that in terms of wanting to preserve a particular identity of this neighborhood, and even the kind of veiled criticism of Hariri's Mustaqbal movement, which has been the driving force behind a lot of this urban development. And yet, somehow I resist just the kind of knee-jerk reaction to just call this a kind of restorative nostalgia, because in some ways there is a kind of a different kind of politics at work here in terms of resisting, for example, the destruction of his own family home, as well as the municipal stadium, which is scheduled, or is a potential site of demolition to put up kind of a new stadium with a mall complex and that kind of thing. So there's this potential kind of politics for wanting to not just preserve the past, but also to really have a public debate about what kinds of new construction projects should go into the community and how they benefit the community or not. So I wouldn't say it's just a restorative politics, but also really a critique of current kind of urban policies and how the public are excluded from that. I want to give two other somewhat different examples. I think we've got time for two more. And so that one, and also I should say that the particular young person who made that story, that was his autobiographical story. And he himself is kind of an old soul. He talks about going into his university classrooms and his fellow students mistaking him for the professor. So he's kind of an old-fashioned kind of guy anyway. So in many ways it's also just his own idiosyncratic kind of personality there. But I want to go to a story that was produced in a kind of intergenerational story. A young person found a cafe, an old cafe that was part of this neighborhood that had been undergoing a lot of change, and he said, I want to go and find out the history of this cafe and why it's still here.
مرة مش ناطر زبوناتي والله بتذكر يكونوا قاعدين حاطين السيارات بس نفضي طاولة نحن معيطين يطلع فعلا يوميا بين غدا وعشاء عنا بين 150 و 200 زبون طعمين ما في حدا يشتري إلا المطعم. هيدا المحل وقت أخذناه كان صغير معنا 79 كبرناه وخمسين تاني كمان. الشغل كان كتير منيح. كان عمري أنا 19 أو 20. سكان مداره كان أغلبيتهم حلبية. ولأن السكان حلبيين عملنا أكل حلبي. هذا غير زبونات سبق الخيل. مداره كان يشغلها سبق الخيل مقابل الحبش. هذا سبق الخيل يجي عالم عليه كتير. إلا يزبط منهم يجي على مداره يتغدوا ويروحوا. استفدنا منهم نحن كمطعم. بال 75 فلينا لأن شارع هون كان كله عرس من الطيون. فتحنا بالرمانة. ما حطينا دعاية ربع ليرة. زبوناتنا خبروا بعض. اشتغلنا كتير. ب 92 خلص حرب. أكيد كان خربان المحل. ما في شيء، كان كله مضروب ومسلوق. بس رجعت أنا لهون. ليه رجعت؟ لأن قبل كل شيء أنا حياتي عايش هون. حياتي انطلاق شغل بلش من هون. ما فيك تنساه، ما فيك تهمله. بلشت بالشغل هون ونجحت هون. ما تنسى صار لي 45 سنة عايش بدارو. بدارو مطعم لأنه وقته من الصبح ونص الليل. أكثر من بيت حتى. وبالقديم ما في حدا بالشارع إلا أنا. هذا محل أساس. نحن بلشنا هون وانشهرنا هون. نحن عملنا بدارو. نحن أول ناس بلشنا دليفري. تخيل بدارو الجديدة ما شفت منها شيء. بدارو صار كراج ما في غير سيارات. سكان بدارو القدم بالحرب راحوا كلهم فلوا. قسم راح على كندا، قسم راح على أمريكا. كل واحد راح على محل وتبع سبق الخيل. هلا مش عم نشوف منهم حدا أبدا. هلا أنا بالنسبة لإلي صار بدك تربي زبونات جيل جديد. والجيل الجديد ما بياكل هيدي الأكلات. الجيل الجديد بياكل همبرجر وهوت دوغ. أصلا كل شارع صار فيه مطاعم كتير، ما في حدا مجبور بقى يجي من الأشرفية لهون. خلص تغير، ما قلت لك تغير، ذوق الزبون تغير، كل شيء تغير.
The story was just so heavily rooted in the nostos. This one is again kind of drenched in the algia, just the longing, quite melancholic kind of nostalgia for the past, but no sense of really wanting to try to reclaim that. It's just kind of living in the space of longing and of reflection of this kind of fractured and fragmented community, his friends and neighbors who've all immigrated, and it doesn't ever kind of resolve to where it should be heading. But that's why I want to play it with his last story in conversation with his last story, which was produced by the same young person, but it's his own autobiographical story, his own kind of reflections about history and place in Beirut, and I think it's good to play them together. So I'll play that and then we'll talk a bit more. And this one is actually called The Horsh, and specifically about this young person's kind of everyday travels as he goes towards the Horsh.
أخذت فان رام 4 ترامي بيروت جديد قبل فقر. أخذته من حد زيكو هاوس ديسكوتاك سبيرز الصناعية. بتطلع شمال بشوف بيوت قديمة اسبانية وفرنسية. ايه كانوا عنا. وببرد راس بشوف شي تاني. بشوف الجراد الأصفر. عم بحكي عن البلدوزرز أكيد. بشوف العمران على أشلاء بيروت القديمة. بترك الشارع القديم الجديد وباخد أوتوستراد فؤاد شارع اللي بيربط غرب المدينة بشرقها قبل ما نفرق على شكان حدود المدينتين بالسبعين اللي مرق بخوية رصاص الأنصب الهلمناني. على تاني ميلي بتذكر إنه من شهرين شفت archaeological site هن وعم يحفروا. وين؟ شو كان؟ حمام روماني أو جامع؟ ما في جواب إلا لصوت الجرافات جبالات البطن وإنه انطمر بس للمرة الأخيرة. دارنا لساحة الشهداء بحب سميها ساحة الأشباح، كانت بأيام الحرب وبعدها بأيام السلم. دارنا للبحر نوصل لتمثال بشارة الخوري شاهد على تغيرات هذه المدينة. نقطع راس النبع نصير على حرش العلم، حرش بيروت جاي يستفقدوا إذا طالوا التغيير أو العمران اللي شفته على طريقي أنا وجاي لعنده. حاول ابحث، اسأل أو تخيل شو بصير. شو بصير إذا جرفته موجة التغيير؟ ولقيت الجواب. لقيت الجواب بالناس اللي بتجي لهم. والجواب هو تختفي قصص كتير، روتين ناس صار سنين. تختفي جزء حياة ساعة من عمرك كل يوم بتمارسها بهالمكان. اللي بيختفي أسلوب نمط حياة متابعه لسنين. فجأة ضغط انقلع منك، مش انت قررت، شيلوه منك. تتغير عادة معودي عليها. تختفي ركبة جورج كل يوم بعد الظهر وقهوة أبو علي اللي صار له 10 سنين بيستنفع منها، وشغف زهير ورفقاته للباسكت اللي صار له سنين عم بيمارسوه هون. تختفي نظرة الأم عم تطلع بابنها عم يكبر قدام عيونها. كان يدبدب صار يركض يطلع على المجروحة وينزل على صحبته. تختفي جمعة عيلة ودق الورق. تتغير قعدة اثنين حبوا بعض ووعدوا بعض، تخانقوا ورجعوا صالحوا على هيدا المقعد. بيختفوا رملة وولادها هيثم وزينب ولمان ودق الركات واللعب الرمل. بيختفوا يوسف خيو سليم ونشوتهم اليومية من 20 سنة من قصقص لشديد. تختفي كلمة بلعة ونتسلى طاهر ولسان محمد. تختفي قعدة علي بنان وأنبا.
Well done. It does present this view, this very kind of palimpsestic view of the city as being kind of multiply layered with these different histories that are being erased and inscribed and reinscribed and erased violently again. So we get that sense of loss that's being mourned here, and yet it's not just a kind of a mournful longing of the past, nor even kind of advocating for return to any kind of romanticized past. And yet it's also refusing just to kind of linger in this longing. There seems to be kind of a hopeful politics driving that, and that's sort of what I want to focus on in my kind of last comments. I realize we're coming to the end of our time. The Italian architect, I should go back to the PowerPoint here, although I only have a few slides left. Let's see, how do I get there? Here we go. The Italian architect Aldo Rossi once wrote of urban ruins that they evoke the interrupted destiny of the individual, of his often sad and difficult participation in the destiny of the collective. The stories we have gathered here on the story map of Beirut bear witness to many interrupted lives, but also they tell the story of young people and others pursuing their own destinies and who are, in the process, striving towards some kind of collective sense of belonging where these multiple destinies can be pursued. These stories play an important, if ambivalent, role in mediating between the collective and the individual, between history and memory. In a way, the stories on the map are similar to smaller narratives of decentralized memory that Makdisi writes about. They are, and that Boehm celebrates in her coining of Restorative Nostalgia. While some stories do tend to produce a particular sanitized version of memory and a somewhat generic expression of Lebanese national identity, most stories seem to embrace the fragmentary nature of memory. However, our sense is that these stories are not told out of what Asil Sawalha refers to as the political weakness of mourning and commemoration. Instead, they are told out of a sense of hope, an urgency to protect the vanishing spaces where these various stories can be told and shared. The stories do not seek to construct a hegemonic narrative of the past, but instead could be seen as narrating into an existence the kind of storytelling collective or public, where memories and desires can be shared, while at the same time advocating for and valorizing particular physical spaces, like the Horsh and other places, that could serve as sites where these publics might materialize. Indeed, what seemed to be a motivating factor for many of these young people in exploring the stories and places of Beirut and of the past was not a fleeting chance to go back there and relive Beirut's romanticized past, although there is some of that, but rather to learn and draw inspiration from aspects of the past in their search for new forms of belonging and citizenship in the present and into the future. And I'll stop there mostly, but speaking of the future, I just want to briefly mention my future, which in part, thanks to the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, very near future this summer, I'll be going back to Nablus, Palestine, and the West Bank, where my PhD research, where I conducted my PhD research, to do some of this digital storytelling work, looking at issues of memory and commemoration of violence in Nablus, as well as recent urban redevelopment there as well. So I'll end it there for questions.